we have at our, literally at our feet here in Ohio. We are in an amazing place at an amazing time. And to start, if you don't know Rails-to-Trails Conservancy, I just wanted to show you the splash page here on the website. Our mission statement actually just changed at the start of the year. So we for the first time in, I think 10 or 11 years, we modified our mission statement. So if you've seen it before, maybe this looks different. We are building a nation connected by trails. We reimagine public spaces to create safe ways for everyone to walk, bike, and be active outdoors. I think the impact of trails certainly in the past year has never been more apparent. And the work that all of you do, anybody involved in the trail movement, your work has never been more impactful, more necessary, and more needed than it has since the pandemic hit. When did the trail movement start? Well, there's, a lot of debate, to be quite honest with you, about when the trail movement started. We could probably go back to when did humans first start walking, right? Trails have always been a part of the human experience, but the multi-use trail movement and certainly the rail trail movement dates back to the 60s. And it was always a very localized thing. It was trail, one trail, maybe if you were lucky, it was a trail that actually connected you to another community, but it was very localized. There wasn't a template for how to do it. You couldn't, all of the resources available to you now, all of the wonderful experts from, local, regional, and national nonprofits to amazing, consultants and firms and private companies that are out there helping communities build trails. That really didn't exist in 1966. And it, so when a community wanted to start building a trail or thought about a trail, and when I use the term trail here, I don't mean, I'm not being holistic. I really am concentrated on multi-use trails. So those of you who maybe concentrate on or specialize in hiking trails or something like that, certainly the story of trails like that are a little different. So I'm not talking about trails in a super holistic manner. I'm really talking about our traditional multi-use, wider rail trail type trails. And so it was a lot harder for communities. You didn't have a lot of examples, and some of the headwinds that the early trail developers had have not gone away, but it's gotten a lot easier, right? Back in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and even 90s, when you were talking about building a trail, you maybe had a lot of skeptics. You had a lot of people thinking, well, that's not a great idea. And quite frankly, you had a lot of people who had never really seen a rail trail, had never really seen, a 10-foot wide multi-use trail. And so there was an honest fear of the unknown, right? We don't know what you're talking about. We're pretty sure we don't like it. And so there was a lot of challenge in the early days of developing trails. It wasn't as easy as saying, well, let's just go 10 miles over there or 50 miles over to that community and check their trail out so you can see what it actually looks and feels like. Back then, there may not have been a nearby trail that you could take people to and show them. Well, that's changed. When Rails-to-Trails Conservancy opened our doors in 1986, you can see here, 250 miles of open rail trail had been built. First rail trail was started in 1966. So in the first 20 years of the rail trail movement, 250 miles of trail had been built. Again, one trail at a time, right? I mean, just they were clawing for every foot. A mile was a huge accomplishment. A mile is still a huge accomplishment. That hasn't changed. But it was very localized. It was project by project, and it was really driven by citizens. It was driven by a passionate few people in communities. Again, I would argue that hasn't changed, but certainly you have a whole lot more involvement now with public agencies and public funding, and we'll talk a little bit about that, Brian. We'll talk a lot more about that on the advocacy and policy part of this presentation. But just imagine what it was like back in the 60s and 70s. In some ways, maybe it was easier. You certainly didn't have all the maybe permits and all of the standards that you had to meet. And you could, a private citizen that could get access to a bulldozer and a backhoe, and that happened. They were building their own multi-use trails. Certainly things like that don't quite happen like they used to, but again, a very localized and very personal experience building these trails. Look where we are now. There's 250 miles of trail in 1986. We're about to cross 25,000 miles of rail trail. The development of trails, it started slowly. And like I said earlier, all of those headwinds and kind of the fear of the unknown, but as more and more trail got built, more and more demand, as people started to see them and experience them, they started wanting them in their community. They wanted to see more of them, and success begot success. So we now stand at almost 25,000 miles of rail trail. There's projects all over the country. It's still really until about the 2000s. It was still very localized though. There was a lot more public support. There was certainly federal funding and other things that were making it easier to develop, but they were still being developed really community by community, one trail at a time, one community at a time. There wasn't a whole lot of discussion around networking, around connections. It was still quite a bit of work just to get one done. And dreaming about, something more interconnected was not that nobody was thinking about that, but it was not first and foremost in trail developers' minds. This is the RTC website. You can see this presentation. I didn't do a PowerPoint. I was starting to, and then I realized I'm just taking images from a bunch of different websites, and why not just show you what the websites look like throughout the presentation. So this is our rail trail statistics site on Rails-to-Trails.org. These are the national numbers. I'm going to go ahead and click on Ohio. We currently in our database have just over 1,000 miles. This is just rail trail, 1,000 miles of rail trail in Ohio. This is the amount of TA money that has come into Ohio. So I'm going to go next. The evolution of trail development, those one trail at a time, right? Fighting and clawing for every single foot, every mile of trail. As the trail community evolved, and as trails became much more ubiquitous, as we saw more and more trails, there were people around the country, RTC certainly, we at the Conservancy, the discussion had been going on for a while, but partners and trail developers and community developers around the country started seeing the opportunity for connectivity and started to really understand that the benefits that a trail was bringing to a community was going to be exponentially increased through connectivity within those areas to the other trails they were building, and then connectivity to everything around them, to other communities. That even expanded to other states, where the idea of connectivity really caught on. The idea of networks really caught on. And the only reason that idea caught on is because of the early developers and the people that worked early on getting these trails built. That you can't create networks unless you have a trail on the ground. So it really was just on the backs of those early trail champions that this discussion was even possible. This is a suite of trail network projects that Rails-to-Trails Conservancy is really involved in around the country. There's a whole lot more than this happening. I am by no means trying to say that this is an exhaustive list or look at all of the network projects going on in the country, but these are the places that RTC has spent a lot of time and effort. And they all look a little different. The idea with the Trail Nation projects were that we wanted to find places that were geographically different. We wanted to find trail network projects that had different challenges so that we could create templates and we could create learning opportunities for anybody in the country that's interested in this work to learn from. And so I'm going to show you a couple of these. First, I'm going to go to the one that touches us here, the Industrial Heartland Trail Coalition. This is a 1,500 mile, 51 county and 4 state trail vision. Discussions about some of these connections go back 30 years. But it was about 8 years ago that these discussions were kickstarted and kind of grew into what has now become the Industrial Heartland Trail Coalition. There is a lot of work going on in these, and I love that when your email notifications come up when you're sharing your screen, another joy of webinars. But like Jody said in the beginning, this is geographically and number of miles wise the largest envisioned multi-use trail network in the country. You can see the major corridors here, and it's building off existing success, just like all trail networks do, right? You have the Great Allegheny Passage, you have the C&O Canal from DC all the way to Pittsburgh. Well, where do we go from there, right? This really is building on the backs of the amazing success that other trail projects have allowed people to think this big. This is about 51% complete. There is a whole lot of work to do, and we're working diligently with a lot of partners around the country on this. Now, this is, when we talk about Ohio, as you can see, this really is, far eastern and northeastern Ohio. There is so much more going on when we talk about trail connectivity. And I'd like to highlight a lot of the work that's happening here in Ohio around networking. In the greater Cleveland area, you have the Cuyahoga Greenway Partners and Cuyahoga Greenways, envisioning this trail system for Cuyahoga County and beyond. It's amazing what they've done. It's really accelerated in the past few years. There are the driving force between Cuyahoga Greenways is called the Cuyahoga Greenway Partners. You have a lot of amazing public agency support and engagement. You've got the nonprofit sector from Bike Cleveland to the Trust for Public Land to Rails-to-Trails Conservancy. It's just a great coalition of people that are driving this, and they're seeing big successes. Cleveland is going to be laying some of the final pieces of the towpath trail, linking it to the shores of Lake Erie at Wendy Park. Hopefully that happens in 2021, dropping the bridge over to Wendy Park and Whiskey Island. So huge successes, but it's all because of all the work that's been done, and then this amazing long-term planning. Move down the state a little bit and you get to Central Ohio Greenways. Special place in my heart for Central Ohio Greenways. I've been a part of the discussion, a part of Central Ohio Greenways from the day I moved to Ohio and working for Rails-to-Trails Conservancy. This is a 15-year effort to bring, again, what was kind of a county by county effort to develop trails in Central Ohio and make sure there was coordination. And the vision that Central Ohio Greenways has laid out is absolutely amazing. 700-mile network eventually. And certainly if you've been through Columbus or in Columbus and been able to check out the trail system there, you understand the success that they've had. I mean, I would argue Columbus has some of the best urban trail infrastructure in the country. And they are very actively and very proactively creating the connectivity that they need. Putting, the Central Ohio Greenways Board of Directors is one of the best structured trail coalitions in the country. There are representatives on their board of directors from private industry, from public agencies, from nonprofits, you name it. And it's a really proactive group that does amazing work. So Central Ohio Greenways is an excellent example of of the evolution of trail development here in Ohio. Not too much farther south and a little to the west, and very selfishly, where I am sitting in the Miami Valley, you have the Miami Valley Trail Network, the largest connected paved trail network in the United States. 330 miles of fully connected paved trails. Absolutely fabulous. Some of the earliest multi-use trails in Ohio were in Dayton, along the levees from the flood control project along the Great Miami. So the Miami Valley Trails not only stand as one of the most mature connected multi-use trail networks that you'll ever find, but they really were one of the guiding lights for Ohio and the country and the Midwest. They were one of the early adopters of putting trails like this on the ground. So when you were in Columbus or Cincinnati or Toledo or anywhere else back in the 80s thinking about doing something like this, you didn't have to go to Chicago. You didn't have to go too far. You just had to make it to Dayton to see an example of what a world-class multi-use trail looked like. So the Miami Valley really did lead the way, and they haven't rested on their laurels. They're still continuing to develop, continuing to create connections, and it's an absolute jewel in the state of Ohio. Then you get down to Cincinnati and you have Tri-State Trails, another one of the newer initiatives really when it comes to the trail connectivity discussion in Ohio. And when you look at just 7 or 8 years ago, when there was no such thing as Tri-State Trails, and there was certainly trail development happening in the Tri-State and in the greater Cincinnati area, but the coordination wasn't 100% there. What they've done in such a short period of time is just absolutely phenomenal. The leadership of Wade Johnson at Tri-State Trails and the coordination between Great Parks, the Metro Park system down there, and other partners working with Tri-State Trails and others that are part of the Tri-State Trail Network. The amount of success they've had in the last 5 or 6 years is truly phenomenal. And just like in Cleveland, where they're about to lay a bridge, there's going to be a pretty exciting bridge in Cincinnati here soon too. Those of you that have used the Little Miami Scenic Trail, which is a key spine there, that bridge by Beachmont is going, that's going to change the experience at the southern end of that trail. And I think, showing these connections have been a real boon in getting some really hard trail pieces built. When you have really expensive things like bridges, tunnels, if you've got expensive urban right-of-way that needs to be purchased, showing how it fits into a network, showing that 1 mile or that one bridge it's not a project in and of itself. It's about the connectivity to these hundreds and even thousands of other miles of trail that won't that won't be connected without this one project. So these connectivity visions really help you in advocating for those really tough, the last pieces that are always the hardest. Being able to show how they fit into this network connectivity really does help you. So what do all these regional networks mean, right? And none of this happens sequentially. All of these are parallel tracks, right? The individual trails that are being built, the visioning around networks, metropolitan area networks and regional networks, and then the long distance spines. I mean, all of these discussions and all of these efforts are happening on parallel tracks. And the father of the Ohio to Erie Trail, Ed Haunton, had this idea many years ago. Predates all of these trail network collaborations. And it's amazing to, again, like all the rest of them, the progress on development of the Ohio to Erie Trail is off the charts. I can tell you, after 10 years of talking about trails and working for Rails-to-Trails Conservancy, and referencing the Ohio to Erie Trail as a wonderful example of connectivity and of working across such a wide swath of geography and jurisdictions, I kept telling myself, boy, I sure do talk about the Ohio to Erie Trail a lot, but I've never ridden it. And I don't think you can ever speak for something with a degree of authority that you otherwise could unless you experience it. So 3 years ago, some friends and I went out and we rode from Cleveland to Cincinnati, and I can tell you, it's just an unbelievable experience. And the work that's been done to help create the Ohio to Erie Trail is an inspiration. If you haven't been, most of you have probably been on at least a portion of it, right? But if you haven't, I certainly suggest that you do. It's getting very close. There's still some gaps. Those gaps are being actively worked on. Every single year there are chunks of those gaps that are being filled in. But it really is a wonderful experience. And I think the other thing that something like a long distance spine like the Ohio to Erie Trail brings you is your trail connectivity projects. So Central Ohio Greenways, Miami Valley Trails, Tri-State Trails, Cuyahoga Greenways. You're also connecting into this statewide project. So Ohio to Erie is creating this connection between all of these amazing, metro and regional trail networking projects. So it's about layering, right? The evolution of trail development really has been about layering. It's that individual trail, then helping spark that network discussion and that connectivity discussion, And then the long distance trail gives you that. So you've got a local, and then you've got a little bit of a metro and regional layer. Ohio to Erie is giving you this statewide layer. Wow, we're connecting into something that is, that's statewide. Well, what's the next layer? What's the next discussion on that evolution? Nationwide, right? And that's the Great American Rail Trail. And we are lucky here in Ohio that the Great American Rail Trail comes right through the state. It is hosted by a whole bunch of local trails. It's also hosted along a chunk of its route, a big chunk of its route, by the Ohio to Erie Trail route. So you're looking at the Ohio section of the Great American Rail Trail. This is 3,700 miles of multi-use trail from Washington, D.C. to Washington State. It's about 51% complete. You can see the gaps. The gaps are in red as well as in these boxes. We are organizationally working with partners from the state level to local jurisdictions throughout Ohio and all of the other 12 states to help fill these gaps in. But again, just like the Ohio to Erie Trail brings this statewide connectivity lens and layer to the work that's happening around Ohio, the Great American brings you this national lens and layer. And all of these things help you on so many levels, right? When you're talking about advocating for creating more connection, creating more trail in your community. If you're connected into the Ohio, if your network is connected to the Ohio to Erie, you use that as part of your narrative. You use that as part of your advocacy. If you're connected into the Ohio to Erie, you're also connected into the Great American Rail Trail. Use that as part of your narrative. Use that in your advocacy to talk about why it's so important to continue to do what you're doing. And ultimately, the Great American Rail Trail is still just a spine, right? And I think the vision of Rails-to-Trails Conservancy, and I'm sure the vision of so many of you that are on this call, that are on this webinar, it is about an entire country connected by trail. It's about creating these spines that connect communities and hoping that you have these robust networks in those communities that connect to the spines. And again, I'll finish up here by saying what we've experienced really since March with the pandemic. I don't want to be a broken record talking about how important trails have been, but I don't think we can overstate how important trails have been. The ability for people to have a safe and accessible place to go outside for mental and physical health through this pandemic has brought a level of understanding of the importance of trails to people who have never thought of it before. Not everybody is a trail enthusiast. Not everybody's tuning in to a webinar at 11:30 on a Wednesday. But I can tell you the number of people who were introduced to trails over the course of this pandemic is unprecedented. The trail use has exploded since the beginning of the pandemic. So many people have gotten out on the trails that many of you helped create, that continue to help maintain. And I don't think it's hyperbole to call them a lifeline. I think they have been so important to the health of our people in our communities. And I think it's our responsibility to continue developing, because the second part of what I said, it's about having a safe place, but you have to have access. And the challenge that we as a trail community have now is that access part. Trails aren't accessible to everybody. They have not been built in an equitable way, whether we're talking urban or rural. There are too many people that do not have this access. And I think that is the challenge of all of this amazing progress we've made in the last 30 years as a trail community. The number one challenge we have in not the 30 years in front of us, the next year, the next 5 years, it is about equity and accessibility and making sure everybody has a chance to access a trail close to home. So with that, I think I will turn it back over to you, Jody.
Tom, did you want to launch the poll?
I'm sorry. Thank you, guys. I totally blew past my poll. I was too in the zone there talking. getting all wound up about trails and I forgot the poll. Yeah, can we do poll question number 1? Guys, we're going to try a couple interactive polls here, just out of curiosity, trying to get an understanding of what trails look like for you. Tom, while you're trying to pull that poll up, I just, since I'm sharing my screen, I'm looking at them.
It is not letting me launch it.
That's all right. I'm going to look at a couple of questions here. If you want to try, go ahead, but no biggie. It's really not. Status of the ODOT State Bike Route Project. I can tell you that Rails-to-Trails Conservancy has not been overly involved in the bike route project. I know we have multiple national and state bike routes that through Ohio. Where possible, I know those bike routes are using trails. So there's a symbiotic relationship between the national and state bike route project and the development of trail connections. But it's not a project that we've been intimately involved in. But certainly there's a lot of overlap between the bike route system and the trail system right now.
I believe Lisa needs to launch the poll.
Hey, there we go. Does your community need help with trail development and or maintenance? Just take 30 seconds maybe and just kind of getting the lay of the land from you guys. As you're answering that, Don, I did notice your question about exclusivity to rail trails. Certainly not, but like I said, definitely what we're talking about or what I was talking about, it is focused on multi-use trails. Not, the numbers I'm talking about, the statistics I'm talking about do not include, hiking trails, mountain biking trails, strictly equestrian trails. These are what I talk about is strictly multi-use. So your typical, 8 to 12 foot multi-use trail.
We have about 84% of the people voting.
That's pretty good voter turnout. Do we have results?
Yeah, I'll end the polling now. Do you want me to share the results here?
Great.
And I think we have another poll.
There should be.
Let's see.
Status of the Cleveland to Pittsburgh Trail. That's a great question. Like other long distance spines, Cleveland to Pittsburgh is chugging along. In fact, if you go to a wonderful partner over there, the Ohio Erie Canalway Coalition, if you go to their website, you'll see a wonderful 1 minute video, minute 30 video that they put up yesterday of the latest extension, or actually it's not an extension, but a gap filling piece of the towpath trail near Bolivar in Southeast Ohio. They got about 1 mile of trail that's being developed right now, and they had a great video of that under construction. So it is moving forward. About 1 mile on the Pennsylvania side. Ribbon cutting would have happened just right around New Year if public ribbon cuttings were a thing right now. So 1 mile at a time, like so many of these things, but there's progress, forward progress, which is always what we're looking for.
We have another quick polling question here that I'll launch.
And this is purely just me wondering whether or not my presentation actually enlightened you, or whether all of you already knew all of this stuff. But were you aware of the extent of connectivity happening?
So I saw Denise's question about COVID impacting funding. I think one answer to that is, at the end of the year, we finally got a capital budget that was the full appropriation for the Clean Ohio Recreational Trails Fund. So that's $6.25 million a year. And there was an additional approximately $12.5 million So in the capital budget, 12.5 million for other trails and active transportation projects. So trails did quite well in the capital budget, despite the budgetarily sensitive times that we are in. And I think that's certainly a nod to, as Eric highlighted, and I think we all know how important the work that we do and what we're advocating for is.
Oh, good. Some of you learned something then. That's wonderful. I do want to point out for all of you, thank you, Julie, so much in the chat. If you want more information about the bike route system, Julie put Kate's contact information in the chat. Kate Harley from ODOT, who has been the project manager there for that project. So thank you very much, Julie. All right.
Okay. Well, thank you, Eric. There will be time for more open collaboration after we hear from our next speaker. But thank you, Eric. Virtual applause here. Good job. Our next speaker is Brian Housh. He is the Rails-to-Trails Conservancy Midwest Policy Manager, as well as an avid cycle, and he is council president in the village of Yellow Springs. His active lifestyle is supported by living along the Little Miami Scenic Trail, which is part of the nation's largest paved trail network. And just a short jaunt from the Ohio to Erie Trail, I'll tell you that. It's definitely worth the side trip. Brian has been actively engaged in regional economic development initiatives that emphasize strategies to enhance quality of life, create jobs, and increase commerce. He does this through arts, culture, and environmental sustainability. Prior to joining RTC, he spent 12 years in Thailand managing his corporate communications training consultancy and leading the charitable efforts of the American Chamber of Commerce. Wow. He serves on the executive committees of the Miami Valley and Greene County Regional Planning Commissions. Let's find out how to plug in as we welcome Brian to the virtual podium. Let me send it to you and let us know if you're able to share. Thanks, Brian. Oh, there you go.
Thank you, Jody. And yeah, I think I am sharing. Yeah, I wanted to, first of all, really highlight that I appreciated Eric's focus on sort of the grassroots traditions of how the trail movement has developed and all the groundwork that's been laid. I think that's really important to some of the things I want to emphasize this afternoon. And, you know, that really kind of connects for me to Eric and I co-present quite often. And I think for several years now, we're often saying something, you know, to the effect of the phrase, you know, strike while the iron's hot. And as Eric pointed out, and as I want to kind of highlight as we kind of open up, there are some great opportunities that have, you know, not only opened up because of crises like the pandemic, but also because of, again, all of that really good background work that's been done. So tied to opportunities, and I'm going to see if I can do full screen. Sometimes this doesn't
There you
work.
go. Great. Thanks.
Yeah, but sometimes it won't advance. So if I have to go back, I will. So the Ohio Trails Vision, one of the things that many of you on this call are aware of, and it's nice to see a lot of familiar faces. In May of 2019, the release of the new state trail plan happened. And I thought it would be interesting just to kind of highlight, to get us into the context of things, a few things that came out of the very broad public participation and also diverse leadership from the advisory team that went into this document. So there was a lot of focus on partnerships and volunteering, volunteers sort of being at the heart of what we've developed in Ohio. That really, Eric highlighted that so well in such a nice visual way also. The other idea that, planning is a really important part of what we do with trail development. And we're always having challenges with funding. The good news is on the federal level, we're seeing some great things happening with potentially expanding recreational trails program, as well as the transportation alternatives funding. And related to the network and spines idea that Eric was showing with the Great American and the Ohio to Erie and the other networks, we also have a connectivity bill that could bring some new funding for that kind of work. And I mentioned earlier that we're happy to see that Clean Ohio is continuing, that capital budget appropriations are going to trail projects. So there are a lot of good things that, that are happening and some opportunities that we can capture this year. Two other things that were highlighted is the need to better market our trails. And there's a really great letter in the Ohio Trails Vision document from the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus co-chairs, where they really emphasize the importance of Tourism Ohio and ODOT and ODNR all working together. So really, really great stuff. And then the final thing here is this idea about connecting people, places, and opportunities. And connectivity is a very important theme as we look forward through this. So there's a lot of opportunities with collaboration, and that's kind of where I wanted to just highlight a few things that should be on everyone's minds as they are advocating for trails this year, as they're thinking about the value of the work that we do. And I really appreciate Denise's question, because what we've been saying for pretty much all of 2020 is that now more than ever is the time to be investing in our trail and active transportation infrastructure. So I'm not going to read through these slides, and we will be sharing this presentation as well as the recording afterwards. So I think most of you know that trail use was up big time, especially initially in the COVID crisis, but we've continued to see much higher levels. Very important in thinking about how we need to support this infrastructure and the maintenance aspect. Eric highlighted this, and it's something that we hear decision makers highlight all the time, is the mental well-being aspect of having these linear parks, these outdoor spaces that we can enjoy. And in general, there are opportunities to safely distance and recreate responsibly, but it also underscores the need for more of this infrastructure. The physical health has always been an aspect that we've highlighted, but it's been interesting to see the mental health and well-being piece really be elevated in the minds of elected officials. I hear this a lot from both state and local electeds. And then, of course, we've always talked about the economic benefits of trails, but again, I think that everyone should be mindful of the fact that legislators, decision makers are in a recovery mode. And so, again, we know that that's going to take some time, but the benefits of trails, not only in terms of just the actual construction and the jobs per dollar that they bring versus roads and bridges projects, but also some of the things that we see related to other businesses that sprout up. We know that, I think most of us probably know that bike shops have been beyond busy. So trying to get a new bike, trying to get a tune-up, those things are all a big challenge. Of course, breweries have always benefited, but we also know from the work that Amy Camp and others have done that economic activity expands beyond the trail and provides a lot of other opportunities. So these are still very relevant talking points. But one thing I guess I want to emphasize throughout this is that if you are advocating for trails and trail network projects, I think it's important to be sensitive to the fact that we are still in not only the COVID crisis, but also thinking about the racism crisis and the recognition that this has become a public health crisis, in fact. So arguments around equity, which Eric mentioned before, trail development maybe has not been the most equitable in the past. We certainly need to focus more on that. And we think in general about the fact that trails and active transportation are part of the overall response to these crises, which also include climate change. And so again, I know some of you are fairly savvy advocates and recognize that different decision makers resonate with different arguments, but we are seeing more and more that the arguments around equity and climate are becoming meaningful to legislators across the board, regardless of where they sit on the political spectrum. And I think we're going to see more and more of that. So these are some of the talking points that we've been developing at Rails-to-Trails, and I know that others are thinking about these things as well. But I thought it would be a good background to kind of talk about some of these opportunities that we see, and then also, as Jody emphasized, how you can plug in. So I wanted to just briefly share this slide, which I've developed recently for some advocate training programs that we're doing. And we launched this series around June of last year when we saw that the Clean Ohio Recreational Trails Fund was at risk of not getting an appropriation. And so there was some targeted work done around developing talking points so that we could ultimately see what we did see was that full appropriation for those 2 years. So for those of you that don't do as much advocacy, and we did have a question that we may pop up later just to see how many are involved. I cannot say enough about how the most powerful experiences or interactions that we've had with legislators, especially state electeds, has been with folks that are sharing personal stories about the trails in their communities that they engage with and how meaningful those are. So these kinds of experiences are really important. Obviously, when we can get those decision makers on the trails, that is really important, and hopefully we'll slowly scale back up to some of those experiential interactions. But I also wanted to highlight here that as you saw in Eric's presentation, the visual aspect is so important. And we're going to be working with various groups to develop one-pagers that highlight some of those maps and other sort of visionary outlooks for trail networks that Eric had shared with us a little while ago. And so I think the other thing that I would highlight here is it's always good when you're interacting with an elected official to have an ask of some sort. So we're going to talk in a minute about finding out whether your state elected official is a caucus member. That's always a great thing to ask them to join the caucus. It's something that if you're not familiar with, I'll explain in a minute, but it's a bipartisan initiative. It's a really easy thing for them to do. Supporting the Clean Ohio Fund, it's renewed every 2 years or every other year, so that's a good thing to think about as well. And I will also highlight that for this next year, the decisions are going to be around operating budget. So there's a few things that I will share about legislative policies that may be brought up during this session that could be relevant.
Do you want me to pop up the poll now?
Sure, why not? All right, yeah, so this one is actually related to whether you know if your state representative or state senator is an Ohio Legislative Caucus member. And we'll go ahead and see what people say about that. And I'll advance to a couple slides that highlight this.
I'll wait till we have about 80% before I share. We've got about 60% right now, so.
Excellent. Well, and this is a good opportunity for me to just, sometimes I forget, the caucus was established in 2017. And the concept of a caucus, if it's not familiar, is a group of legislators basically getting together around a particular concept. And in this case, it's advocating for trails. And these are trails of all types with a particular focus on non-motorized. Established in March 2017. So sorry about that if you heard that phone ringing. But essentially, we are moving into the fourth year of the caucus, and there's a real intentional effort by the caucus leadership to create a legislative agenda for 2021. So Lisa, I guess if we want to share the results and see who knows what. All right, not sure. All right. And that's a great answer because it leads to an opportunity. And I'll share, and it looks like Jody's also helping me out in the chat. There are three links that I have listed here, and we'll also share this. The first one is, if you don't know who your state elected officials are, a really easy way to determine that is to go to legislature.ohio.gov, and you enter your address or your zip code, and it'll pop up who they are. So then if you are curious next, if they are a member of the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus, showing their commitment to connecting Ohioans across the state, there's a rather long link here, but also if you do a Google search on Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus, this is the first thing that comes up, always comes up. And we update that list. Currently, the caucus has 49 members. That's 49 out of 132 legislators. We have senators and representatives, a lot of Republicans and Democrats. It's a really healthy caucus, which can always use more members. And so then that gets kind of to the third point. If you are not sure, then you can use this link, which is rails-to-trails.org. And then it's just a / Ohio Caucus or OH Caucus. And what's great about this tool is when you enter your address, you can automatically send a letter to your senator and representative asking them to join. And if they're already on the caucus, it identifies that and will not send them a letter. So it's a nice tool to use. And yeah, so I will hop back to a few other things that I wanted to highlight, and then we'll roll into some questions. So I wanted to kind of roll from thinking about telling your stories to how you can apply some of that work. And I wanted to build off a little bit of what Eric talked about. And I was also asked by some folks to maybe kind of think about how do you get a trail project started for some of you that are thinking about that. And many of you are probably at different stages. But I wanted to just briefly run through. I thought Eric's presentation did such a nice job of showing this kind of overall statewide and nationwide vision for trail connectivity. And note that this is something that when you are thinking about it on a more local level, I wanted to share an example of something we've been working on in Yellow Springs and Clifton, and sort of show you how a local vision might work. So some of these images may be familiar. The Yellow Spring Station at the top, the Yellow Spring in Glen Helen Nature Preserve in the middle, and then the Clifton Mill in the village of Clifton at the bottom. And the idea of the Yellow Springs Clifton connector was one to not only connect our villages, Yellow Springs and Clifton, but also connect three parks, the Glen Helen Nature Preserve, John Bryan State Park, and the Clifton Gorge Nature Preserve. So it's a really great story. And based on that vision, that helped us think about who needed to be engaged. From the very beginning, we engaged our state electeds, county agencies, ODOT, ODNR, as well as business owners and so forth. And that really helped a lot later on to do things like get a small capital budget appropriation to help with the design work and so forth. So then, I think it's really important that you think about, expanding your initial core group that's got that vision with some of these folks and be strategic about who also can be involved. A process that can be fairly labor intensive is getting all the ideas on the table around alignments and then starting to think about the challenges, the non-starters, and the refinements. In our case, we had at least a dozen alignments, and there were challenges on every one. So, it took some time to get down to one where we could all get on the same page. But, knowing that we've got one or two tool design folks on the call, and Eric mentioned this as well, things have become a lot easier with groups like Tool Design who helped us to really sort of get things together around the pre-design so that you can start thinking about these next steps around finalizing your alignment, thinking about a plan. We thought phasing was a really good idea, both to think about funding streams, but also to show sort of continual movement. And then, I think we could talk a little bit more about funding if people have questions about that. I alluded to some great things that are happening on the federal level. And I also want to mention that, again, things look good on the state and local level, but I would not expect, at least in this next year, seeing a lot of new funding for trails. I think defending what we have, working through the operating budget on making sure that agencies have capacity to deliver on administration and programming. Those are the kinds of things that are going to be really important to keep in mind. And there are a lot of policy related things that we can do, which I'll share in just a minute. The other thing I do want to highlight here related to funding and getting started is how important it is to coordinate as much as possible with other projects and activities that might be going on. In the case of Yellow Springs, we have a trail, it's called the Agraria Trail, that got a Clean Ohio grant that is going to kind of reach out into our township and connect into our middle school, high school, and into the community, which ties in nicely to, we developed an active transportation plan that was funded by ODOT and Department of Health. And that allowed us to create a plan that ultimately secured 1.8 million in federal dollars that connects nicely with bringing the Agraria Trail more into the heart of our community. And then a third piece is we secured a Safe Routes to School grant, which helps build a sidewalk and connect our elementary school to some of these other aspects. So I share that for two reasons. One, it underscores how important planning is. But secondly, what we've been able to do with all these projects intersecting is gain efficiencies around cost savings and so forth, and just coordinating those activities, which kind of ties back to like those steps 1 and 2 that I highlight here, which is making sure you think broadly about who should be at the table. So anyway, wanted to tee that up. There's an URL at the bottom that was referenced earlier, the RTC Trail Building Toolbox. gives a lot more detail and goes in depth on the logistics of some of these things. I wanted to kind of give it to you more from a, I guess, a policy elected official background in thinking about how you get the buy-in and build the constituencies that you need to be successful. All right. So I want to talk about one final thing, and then we'll wrap up and turn to questions, and that is the Ohio network, which is related to the plug-in pitch that I'm going to wrap things up with. For those of you that are not aware of the Ohio network, this is a group that we formed around the same time as the caucus. The idea was to bring together a diverse group of constituents to leverage our ability to advocate for trails and things that are related to that. So when I talk about diverse collection of stakeholders, this is a lot of kind of how we thought about our own project, the Yellow Springs Clifton Connector. We wanted to bring in, of course, trail managers, agencies, but also think about that chamber presence and other business involvement. Land trusts are huge with many of the trail projects that we're involved in across the state, and also thinking about other nonprofits, transit, health, economic development, you name it. So the Ohio network initially met regularly. We now meet periodically, especially when there are opportunities. It's a great email list to be on for updates about some of those opportunities. And also when things like the Clean Ohio Fund might be at risk, then we reach out to everybody to do what we can, letter writing and whatnot. And we recently met right at the end of December to kind of talk about this opportunity that I referenced earlier with the Ohio Legislative Trails Caucus, which is intending to meet at the end of the month. They haven't set a date yet, to talk about a legislative agenda for 2021 and probably beyond that. And I wanted to highlight a few things that have come that sort of have elevated, and then we'd love to hear your thoughts, because there are plenty of opportunities for everyone to contribute to that discussion and what that agenda ultimately looks like. So one of the things that is definitely very important, and it's been a theme throughout this trail talk, is connectivity and maintenance. And I know I saw at least one question in the chat about maintenance. So, one of the things that that is true for the recreational trails program, for example, that federal program is, it was originally sort of thought of as a way to cover those maintenance issues. In some cases, that funding has moved away from that original intent. So having more funding around RTP and advocating for the importance of maintenance is certainly important. I can also say a lot of the county trail plans that are being developed are incorporating maintenance in thinking about how you ultimately build out that network. So this kind of movement is very important, and it's definitely something that we want to continue to advocate for. One of the concepts that came up in the that is in the Ohio Trails Vision, so the new state trail plan, is the idea of an interagency working group. So the agencies that have been originally identified or initially identified for sure are DNR, DOT, health, and tourism. But there's certainly opportunities for other agencies like Ohio EPA often has a role with trail plot projects and so forth. And the idea is for these agencies to collaborate more intentionally to help with a lot of issues that I know many park managers and trail managers deal with in getting projects done, such as permitting, funding cycles. There are a variety of other things that we've heard about, which will kind of relate to, we'll tee up a discussion about what your needs might be. A statewide economic impact study has been something that has been on the list for the caucus since it was originally established in 2017. And this is also associated with the agency capacity, giving the agencies the resources they need to administer these programs. These are the two sort of short midterm goals that have been on the list originally and are things that we think more advocacy around can really help. A statewide economic impact study could obviously have local dimensions and could really help with making the case for funding, not just state funding, but also federal funding, and also highlight what opportunities we see for Ohio overall. And a final thing, ask your state elected officials to join the caucus. I shared that link before. It's a really easy thing to do. And the more members of the caucus, the more political will we have around moving some of these activities forward. So I'm gonna stop sharing there. And Jody, I don't know if you want to share that slide that you had some of the things about where you might need advocacy help. And then also, Jody, Eric, I didn't follow the chat, so if there are any particular questions that you want to tee up, great to launch into those.
I'll do that.
Brian, I don't see any outstanding questions. There was some interest in just discussing funding opportunities, and it's a little more open-ended, but I don't see a specific question.
Excellent. So I'll say this, I'm going to actually have Eric, he does a nice job of talking a little bit more about those federal funding opportunities, but I'll just say this slide are just potentially some things that are on our radar that we may be bringing to the caucus as potential, initiatives to include in that agenda. But we'd love to hear other thoughts about that. So Eric, I'll let you maybe talk about that federal funding stuff a bit more.
Sure. Yeah, so I mean, I'll kind of do a little bit of a laundry list here of things that if they're not on your radar screen, they should be, and then some of the contacts that you'll want to make, depending on what kind of project you're looking at. When it comes to development projects, you have a trail or you have some sort of active transportation project that you want to build. First and foremost, figure out whether or not where your project is falls under the jurisdiction of a metropolitan planning organization or not. But the federal, because that will determine whose program you would apply to. If you're within an MPO, you'll want to reach out to that MPO and ask them about the Transportation Alternatives Program. Depending on how large of a metro area, you also might have congestion mitigation and air quality, CMAQ funding that can go towards these projects. There's also then at the state level, we have federal funds that are administered by DNR through the Recreational Trail Program. And like Brian said, the Recreational Trail Program maintenance is an eligibility. And I think one important thing, and I would encourage you to sign up for the Ohio Network. Brian administers that group and the discussion around advocacy with that group. A key piece of advocacy is going to start happening at the federal level this year. The new transportation bill, which dictates and guides funding for transportation projects, including trails and active transportation. All indications are that it will be a top priority in this Congress. So there'll be a need for voices, and so please engage. And the early versions of the bill that came out of both the House and the Senate last year looked encouraging for trail and active transportation interests. And one of those, I'll go over a couple things that were in it. One of them would be a potential, fairly large, perhaps doubling of the recreational trail program funding. And what we're also trying to do is get some further federal guidance on rec trail funding to help steer that money more towards maintenance projects. So be engaged on the advocacy side to help, because it's not about Rails-to-Trails Conservancy working in DC on this. It doesn't matter if we go talk to people if we don't have all of you behind that, behind us when we have our policy folks working on the Hill. So engage and say that that's what that you do have that need, and you do need to see both an increase in funding as well as an emphasis on the maintenance side. There were increases for transportation alternatives in the draft bills as well, which is great. Then there's another new program that was included in the bills. We're still working on some details, but it would essentially be a trail connectivity grant program, which I think lends perfectly to the discussion and presentation that I gave earlier. The idea here, if you're familiar with what used to be called the Tiger program, is now called the Build program. The idea here would be to get larger funding awards out to communities, but really to regions, and where it's not for a single project. It would be for a package of project to help get your networks or your long distance connectivity spines further along. So that would be a really exciting program. It would be built out within the transportation bill and would kind of act like a Trails and Active Transportation Tiger program. Currently, the Tiger Build program, Trails and Active Transportation are eligible, but you are competing against interstate bridges. You are competing against massive traditional highway projects. In this program, you would only be competing with other trail networking and connectivity projects. So if that's included, and we feel fairly good about it being included, that'll be another really great funding opportunity.
Yeah, Eric, that reminds me, I should jump in also with people have been asking about the Great American Outdoors Act and what that does for trails. And so I want to highlight, and I've got, there's a nice write-up on the RTC website, but I've also got another article I could share if anyone's interested. So one of the things to keep in mind is that the funding, which is great, it permanently funds the Land and Water Conservation Fund, but it's targeted at least for the next 5 years on park maintenance. So that's a good thing in terms of the maintenance on trails that would be associated in those parks. The other thing that it can be used for is land acquisition, which can have some benefits for trails as well. So it's not necessarily a direct way to fund our gaps on the Ohio to Erie, for example, but it will have some other collateral benefits because it potentially means that ODNR could shift some of the funding to other areas potentially. So watch out for that one, but it was a positive certainly for our general movement.
There's a question here from Doug about resurfacing. Again, kind of falls into a heavy maintenance. Resurfacing is eligible under the recreational trail program through DNR. Although I do need to do a little bit of investigating over in Eastern Ohio. The Conotton Creek Trail was just awarded almost $1 million from DOT to resurface the Conotton Creek Trail. Obviously, DOT is not who administers the rec trail program. So I need to do a little sleuthing on whether or not there was a way to get TA funding or that's coming from what exact program that came from. That just happened at the end of last week. I was just informed of that, and it's wonderful news, but I need to figure out what program they were able to get resurfacing money from.
Thank you, Eric and Brian. With the remaining time, we have the option of breaking into smaller breakout groups, and then one of us that have been the presenters and the team will join you in those breakout rooms. So why don't we conclude the larger group here, and then as you go into the breakout rooms, you'll be able to ask your question verbally if you would like to. And we want to thank everybody for being here today. The recording of today's webinar will be, we'll have it as a link, and we'll follow up with folks for an after webinar email, and you will be able to view it in its entirety. So we'll go into 5 breakout rooms, and those will be assigned randomly. So if there's not a host there when you first get there, there will be one joining you shortly. And this is your time to connect with others, ask questions, and just sort of solidify some of the information that you've gained today. Thank you, and we'll see you in the breakouts. Here we go. You will see an invitation on your screen, and if you click into that, you'll be in the smaller rooms. Thanks, everybody. All right, looks like Brian is in